"I think you're in the wrong cabin, miss." The voice was sharp, coated in the kind of casual arrogance that lives only in places like this. The air in first class is always different, isn't it? It's thick with the smell of entitlement and quiet money. 17-year-old Zoe felt at the moment she stepped onto plane, a wave of cold judgment washing over her bright orange hoodie and jeans. Every head turned. The man in seat 2C, Mark Peterson, looked her up and down, his tailored suit a uniform of condescension. He didn't just speak the words. He announced them to the entire cabin, making her a spectacle. He smirked, leaning back in his leather seat, and repeated himself, this time gesturing with a dismissive flick of his wrist. Economy is toward the back of the plane. This wasn't a mistake. It was a performance. But what he didn't know, what no one in that silent, watching cabin knew, was that he wasn't the one in control. Zoe was. When someone's prejudice gives them that much confidence, do you think they ever see the trap they're walking into? The silence in the cabin became a character of its own. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from the stares of the other passengers. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others watched with detached curiosity, as if Zoe were a scene in an in-flight movie. A few, she noticed, nodded in quiet agreement with Peterson. In their world, a young black girl in a hoodie simply didn't compute in seat 2A. The rows of luxury seats became invisible cages, where stares judged more than words ever could. Zoe clutched her boarding pass, the flimsy paper suddenly feeling like a shield. She was on her way from Atlanta to a massive tech summit in San Francisco, a place where her mind, not her appearance, was supposed to matter. But on this plane, she was reminded that for some people, the first impression is the only one they'll ever allow. Just as attention peaked, a flight attendant named Susan rushed over, her expression of strained hospitality already siding with the man in the suit. "Sir, is there a problem?" she asked, her voice a smooth, practice bomb meant only for him. She didn't even look at Zoe. Peterson pointed a thumb at Zoe. "She is. I paid a lot of money for this experience, and I don't appreciate disturbances." Experience. The word hung in the air. This wasn't just a flight. It was a curated bubble of privilege, and Zoe was the unwelcome interruption. Susan finally turned to Zoe, her smile gone, replaced by a dismissive glance that traveled from her sneakers to her braids. "Honey, let me see your ticket." The word honey dripped with condescension, a verbal pat on the head for a child who had wandered into the adult section. The sting of public humiliation was a hot flash on Zoe's skin. The whole cabin was watching, waiting to see the girl in the hoodie get put in her place. With a steady hand, fighting the tremor of anger that ran through her, Zoe held out the boarding pass. It clearly read, Zoe Washington, seat 2A. Susan took it, but her eyes barely registered the name. She saw the seat number, and a flicker of confusion crossed her face before it was replaced by a shared, conspiratorial eye roll with Peterson. The gesture was small, but it was a declaration. It said, "We are on the same side. She is the problem." Zoe watched it happen, a silent transaction of bias that sealed her fate in their minds. But the boarding pass in Susan's hand wasn't just a ticket. It was the first piece of evidence. And as Susan opened her mouth to dismiss it, Zoe knew this was just the beginning. For a fraction of a second, the world held its breath. The boarding pass was in Susan's hand, the letters and numbers clear and undeniable. 2A. This was the moment for facts to win, for the system to work as designed. But systems are run by people, aren't they? And Susan had already made her choice. She glanced down, not to read, but to confirm her own bias. A small, satisfied smirk played on her lips as she shared that conspiratorial eye roll with Mark Peterson. The message was clear. The evidence doesn't matter. Our reality is the only one that counts. "There must be a glitch in the system," she announced, her voice filled with false sympathy. She handed the ticket back to Zoe as if it were a piece of trash. "First class is fully booked. These things happen sometimes." She was creating a fiction, a corporate-approved story to explain away her prejudice. One piece of paper, a contract with the airline, held Zoe's entire right to be there, but it was weightless against the crushing force of years of ingrained bias. In that moment, one uniform held more power than documented truth. Zoe felt a hot flash of shame, the kind that makes you feel small and exposed. Every passenger was watching, and now they had a reason to believe she was in the wrong. Susan and Peterson had painted her as a mistake, a system error that needed to be corrected. But beneath the shame, something else was hardening: resolve. She would not be erased this easily. "My actual seat," Zoe said, her voice quiet but steady, cutting to the cabin's stale air, "is 2A." The simple refusal to be moved, the calm defiance, was not what Susan expected. She wanted tears or a nervous retreat. She wanted a girl who would shuffle back to economy with her head down. Instead, she got a CEO, though she didn't know it yet. Susan's strained smile vanished, replaced by a mask of corporate authority. "Look," she said, her tone shifting from condescending to threatening, "I am not going to argue with you." She reached for the intercom phone above the seat. "We have procedures for this. It's a matter of operational necessity." The threat was no longer just about moving her. It was about framing her as a problem that required a professional solution, and she was about to call in the next layer of that system to crush a truth it refused to see. When you're facing prejudice, calling a manager is supposed to be the solution, right? It's supposed to bring in a neutral party, someone to look at the facts and make things right. But sometimes you're not calling for a referee. You're just calling for a bigger bully. The click of the intercom phone being hung up echoed in the silent cabin. Susan stood back with a look of vindicated pride, folding her arms as if to say, "Now you're going to get it." The air grew thicker with anticipation. Mark Peterson sipped his water, a smug spectator at a show he had produced. Zoe remained standing, a solitary island in a sea of hostility. She knew what was coming. It wasn't help. It was reinforcement. A moment later, a man with a stiff posture and an aggressive stance stormed into the first-class cabin. This was Paul. He didn't walk. He marched, his presence designed to intimidate. His eyes scanned the scene and landed immediately on Zoe, the only person of color, the only one in a hoodie, the only one standing. He didn't need to ask any questions. His mind was already made up. "We have a passenger causing disturbance," he announced, his voice booming. He wasn't asking a question. He was making a declaration, and his glare was the verdict. Susan rushed to his side, handing him Zoe's boarding pass like an exhibit of her guilt. "She refuses to move to her correct seat, Paul. Her ticket is glitching, but she won't listen." Paul took the ticket from Susan's hand, but it was pure theater. He barely glanced at it. His focus was entirely on Zoe, his expression hardening. To him, that piece of paper was an annoyance, a minor detail in the way of restoring order. "Our manifest is correct," he stated, his voice flat and final. "The passenger's ticket is not. Have you ever been in a situation where the truth is in your hand, clear as day, but the person in power refuses to even see it? That's the moment your voice starts to feel worthless." He hadn't investigated. He hadn't checked the system. He had simply looked at a 17-year-old black girl and decided she was a disturbance. He was a human embodiment of the system's closed loop. The complaint, the confirmation bias, and the enforcement all rolled into one angry man in a slightly better-fitting uniform. The power wasn't in the truth. It was in his title, and he was about to use it. He took a step closer to Zoe, deliberately invading her space, a classic power move. The fake smile was gone, replaced by a cold, official glare. He was done playing games. This is the moment, isn't it? The point where a quiet injustice becomes a public spectacle. Paul leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone meant only for her, but loud enough for the first few rows to hear. "Ma'am," he said, the word a complete mockery of respect. "Either you come with me to back, or I'll have you removed from my aircraft." There it was, the final offer. There was no room for discussion, no space for the truth, just a choice between two forms of humiliation. She could accept defeat and take the walk of shame to economy, confirming in everyone's mind that she was imposter. Or she could be physically escorted off the plane, a scene that would forever brand her as a troublemaker. The silence in the cabin was deafening. It was a physical presence, pressing in on Zoe from all sides. The other passengers were no longer just observers. They were witnesses. Their silence was a verdict. In a space full of powerful people, Executives, lawyers, maybe even a politician or two. Not a single person spoke up. Not one person said, "Let me see her ticket." Not one person questioned Paul's authority. Their inaction was a powerful statement. Her dignity was not worth interrupting their quiet, comfortable flight. This is how the system works. It doesn't always need loud racists. Often, the silence of the powerful is enough to let injustice win. Zoe looked past Paul's smug face, scanning the rows of silent passengers. She saw pity in some eyes, annoyance in others, but not a single trace of solidarity. She was completely, utterly alone, and in that moment of total isolation, something inside her shifted. She had played their game. She had shown her proof. She had used a calm voice. She had done everything you're supposed to do when you're in the right, and it had failed. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed to. It was designed to protect the comfort of men like Mark Peterson and the authority of men like Paul. It was not designed to protect her. So, she would have to use her own system. The doors of the aircraft would be closing any second. The confrontation, she realized, was just unfortunate cover for the real mission. Paul stood there, arms crossed, expecting her to crumble. He was waiting for her surrender. The entire cabin was waiting. But Zoe didn't look toward the back of the plane. She didn't look at Paul. She simply broke eye contact, a new calm settling over her as she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Everyone expected surrender. Paul's smirk said it all. He thought she was calling her mom, or maybe a friend, to cry about being kicked out of first class. The phone in her hand was, in his eyes, a symbol of her weakness, a child's last resort. Mark Peterson sighed dramatically, checking his expensive watch. The whole cabin was poised for the inevitable walk of shame. But Zoe wasn't calling anyone. Her face was a mask of calm focus. Her thumbs moved with a speed and precision that was almost unnerving. She wasn't panicking. She was executing. The message was 3 words, a short, coded signal that held more power than all of Paul's blustering threats. He's seated. Go. She hit send. And then nothing. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and looked up at Paul, her expression unreadable. What does it mean when the person you've cornered shows no fear? When they don't fight back, but they don't surrender either? Paul's confident stance wavered for just a second. This wasn't in the script. He expected tears, pleading, or an angry outburst. He didn't expect this quiet confidence, this eerie calm. The power dynamic in the aisle shifted, just slightly. It was a silent, vibrating tension, a feeling that a gear had just clicked into place somewhere unseen. That single text message was a key turning a lock miles away. It was a digital command that would set in motion a chain of events that no one in that first-class cabin could ever have predicted. Paul saw a defiant teenager. The other passengers saw a minor airport drama. No one saw the CEO of a cybersecurity firm given the green light for a federal operation. They all thought the fight was happening in the aisle, right in front of them. But the real power, the hidden power, is rarely the one that makes the most noise. It's the one that moves silently in the background until it's ready to strike. And as Paul opened his mouth to issue his final command, he had no idea that the game was already over. While Paul was busy playing the role of the big boss in the aisle, something else was happening a few rows back. A well-known tech blogger, flying to the same summit as Zoe, recognized the scene for what it was, a perfect storm of injustice, privilege, and power, all about to be caught on camera. He knew a viral story when he saw one. With practiced discretion, he propped his phone up against the window. The camera aimed perfectly. He didn't say a word. He just hit the go live button and typed a title that was pure fire. Airline staff tries to eject black teen from first-class seat she paid for. At first, a few hundred of his followers tuned in, then a few thousand. The algorithm, sensing the outrage, began pushing the stream everywhere. Within 60 seconds, 10,000 people were watching. Within 2 minutes, it was 100,000. The numbers climbed at a dizzying rate. The comment section was a waterfall of fury. This is pure racism. One comment flew by. Don't let her move. She has every right to sit there. Another typed. People were screen recording, sharing the link, tagging the airline. tagging news outlets. "What airline is this?" became the roaring chorus. An army of digital witnesses had formed, and they were incandescent with rage. The irony was suffocating. Inside the climate control bubble of first class, Paul and Susan felt completely in control, protected by their uniforms and the silent complicity of the other passengers. They were operating in what they thought was a closed system, a private space where their authority was absolute. They had no idea that their faces were being broadcast to a global audience, that their every word, every condescending smirk was being judged by millions. They couldn't hear the roar of the online crowd. They couldn't see the thousands of angry emojis flooding the screen. They were like actors on a stage who couldn't see the massive, furious audience sitting in the dark, watching their every move. The blogger zoomed in as Paul delivered his ultimatum, threatening to remove Zoe from the aircraft. The viewer count exploded past 1 million. People online were screaming at their screens. They were watching a young black girl stand her ground against a wall of corporate power and prejudice, and they felt utterly helpless. They were witnesses to a slow-motion car crash of injustice. Paul, oblivious, took a final, authoritative step toward Zoe. "Right, that's enough," he said, his patience gone. He reached out, his hand aiming for her arm to escort her away. The entire internet held its breath. But just as his fingers were about to close around the fabric of her orange hoodie, a calm, firm voice cut through the tension from behind him. "That won't be necessary." Paul turned, annoyance flashing across his face, ready to put another person in their place. But the words died in his throat. The two men standing behind him were not passengers asking for directions. They were tall, wore impeccably tailored dark suits, and moved with a quiet, unnerving calm that made Paul's supervisory authority feel like a child's costume. They didn't even look at him. Their eyes were fixed on their targets. With a professional grace that was completely out of place in the cramped airplane aisle, they walked past the frozen flight crew. One man stopped directly in front of Mark Peterson. The agent didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "FBI, Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice a low, steady hum of absolute power as he flashed a badge. "You're under arrest for smuggling contraband on a private cargo manifest." The entire first-class cabin seemed to suck in its breath at once. If you could hear the sound of a worldview shattering, that was it. Mark Peterson, the man who had so confidently sneered at Zoe just minutes ago, the man whose experience was paramount, turned a ghostly shade of white. The arrogance melted off his face, replaced by raw, primal fear. His jaw worked, but no sounds came out. The smug smirk was gone, and in its place was the face of a man whose life had just ended. This was never about a seating mistake. It was never about a hoodie or misplaced teenager. The drama Zoe was being subjected to was just a final scene in a much larger, much more dangerous play. Susan and Paul were statues. Their mouths hung open, their minds scrambling to reconnect the dots. The disturbance, the glitch in the system, it was all lie, but not in the way they thought. They had picked a side, so confidently, so smugly, and they had chosen to stand with a federal criminal. Their judgment wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. But the shock was only just beginning. Then, the second truth dropped like a bomb. The other FBI agent turned his attention to Paul and Susan, his expression unreadable. He gestured with a slight nod toward Zoe, who had remained perfectly still through the entire ordeal. "This is our key witness," he said, his voice cutting to the stunned silence. The statement alone was enough to make Paul and Susan flinch. But the agent wasn't finished. He let the silence hang for a beat before delivering the final, devastating blow. And the CEO of the cybersecurity firm that uncovered Mr. Peterson's entire operation. CO, the word echoed in the silent cabin louder than a gunshot. Every head, every pair of eyes swiveled back to Zoe. They weren't looking at a lost teenager anymore. They were looking at the single most powerful person on the entire aircraft. The orange hoodie and jeans didn't look out of place now. They looked like a disguise. The shame and humiliation that had been forced on her a moment ago now radiated from the faces of Paul and Susan. The power hadn't just been reversed. It had been annihilated. The cabin was dead silent. The only sound, the faint hum of the engines, as everyone stared, trying to reconcile the image of the girl they had judged with the woman she had just been revealed to be. And just as the silence became unbearable, a new sound cut through the air, a sharp, digital ringing. It was coming from Zoe's laptop. The sharp, insistent ringing of the laptop cut through the cabin's stunned silence. As if on cue, the FBI agents began escorting a slumped, gray-faced Mark Peterson down the aisle. The man who had boarded with so much arrogance was now a ghost, his tailored suit looking like a costume on a scarecrow. He kept his eyes on the floor, refusing to meet the gaze of the passengers he had tried to impress. Whispers and murmurs erupted as he passed, the sound of the power structure collapsing in real time. But the real drama wasn't the man being arrested. It was the call that was still ringing. Every eye was now on Zoe. She moved with an unhurried grace, walking past the frozen figures of Paul and Susan and taking her rightful place in seat 2A. She didn't sit down. She simply looked at the glowing screen of her laptop, which rested on her tray table. A few rows back, the tech blogger, realizing this was the story's next huge twist, zoomed his camera in, capturing the screen for his 2 million viewers. And there it was, clear as day. The caller ID wasn't just a name. It was a name and the smiling corporate headshot of the airline's own CEO. This is the moment when confusion turns into pure panic. Why would the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar airline be video calling a 17-year-old girl on one of his planes? The question hung in the air, terrifying in its implications. For Paul and Susan, the blood drained from their faces. This was a nightmare. The FBI arresting a first-class passenger was a disaster. The revelation that the girl they'd harassed was a witness and a CEO was a catastrophe. But a direct call from a man at the very top of the corporate food chain, that was an execution. They were no longer just employees who had made a mistake. They were the public face of a viral scandal, and their boss was on the line, calling their victim directly. They were outside the chain of command, completely exposed. The corporate ladder they had spent their careers climbing had just been kicked out from under them. All the rules, all the procedures, all the talk of operational necessity was meaningless now. There's no corporate script for when the person you try to eject has the CEO on speed dial. The call kept ringing, each chime an unbearable siren, counting down the final seconds of their careers. Paul and Susan could only stand there, paralyzed by a dread so profound it was almost silent. They watched as Zoe's finger moved calmly, deliberately, toward the green answer button on the screen. Zoe's finger tapped the screen. The ringing stopped. For a heartbeat, the only sound in the first-class cabin was the terrified, shallow breathing of a flight supervisor and his attendant. The CEO's face materialized on the laptop screen. He wasn't smiling like he was in his corporate headshot. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes blazing with fury that seemed to radiate through the small screen. This was not a man who was about to have a pleasant chat. This was a man who was about to burn his own company to the ground to get rid of a rot. Zoe didn't say a word. She didn't have to. In a single deliberate movement, she picked up the laptop and turned it around, so the screen faced Paul and Susan directly. She was no longer the accused. She was the executioner's assistant. The CEO's voice exploded from the small speakers, a digital roar that was more powerful than any in-person confrontation. He addressed them by name, a sound that made them both visibly flinch. Paul? Susan. His voice was dangerously low. I, along with about 2 million other people, have just watched your disgraceful conduct on a viral live stream. The words hit them like a physical blow. 2 million people. The private little drama they thought they were managing had been a global spectacle. Their faces, their condescending words, their biased actions, all seen, all judged. Paul's face, which had been read with authority just moments before, was now a waxy, pale sheet. Susan looked like she might collapse. The CEO wasn't finished. You are both suspended, effective immediately. You will be met by corporate security when you land. It was brutal. It was instant. There was no HR meeting, no 2 weeks' notice, no chance to explain their side of the story. They were fired in the most public and humiliating way imaginable, in front of the very person they had tried to humiliate. And then came the final, soul-crushing command, the one that solidified the new world order on this aircraft. Now get out of my sight, the CEO boomed, and let yourself sit in her seat. Your CEO. He didn't say the CEO. He said your so. He was telling them that in this moment on this plane, Zoe's authority superseded theirs. She was, for all intents and purposes, their boss. The 17-year-old girl in the orange hoodie they had dismissed as a lost child was now the undisputed ruler of the cabin. The power reversal was absolute. It was a complete public annihilation of their status. They had built their careers on the flimsy authority of a uniform and a title, and in less than 30 seconds, it had all been stripped away by a teenager with a laptop. Paul and Susan just stood there for a second, utterly broken. Then, without a word, they turned and began their own walk of shame down the aisle. The battle for seat 2A was over. But as Zoe calmly turned the laptop back around, the look on her face wasn't one of triumph. It was a look of someone who had just won the first small skirmish in a much, much larger war. With Paul and Susan gone, a strange quiet fell over the first-class cabin. On the laptop screen, the CEO's face softened from incandescent rage to something closer to exhausted concern. He started to speak, the usual corporate damage control script ready on his lips. Ms. Washington, on behalf of the entire airline, I am so sorry. But Zoe held up a hand, a simple, quiet gesture that stopped him cold. The apology was a period, an attempt to end the sentence. Zoe was about to show him it was only a comma. She finally sat down in her seat, the throne she had fought for. She looked into the laptop's camera, not as a victim, but as a peer. With all due respect, sir, she said, her voice calm and measured, this isn't about me, and it isn't about Susan or Paul. The CEO was visibly taken aback. The passengers who were still shamelessly listening leaned closer. This wasn't the reaction anyone expected. This isn't about one bad flight or two employees who made a poor judgment call. Zoe continued, her voice gaining strength. This is about a system that trained them to see a black teenager in a hoodie and immediately assume she was in the wrong. They didn't see a passenger with a valid ticket. They didn't see a customer. They looked at me, and their brains filled in a story that wasn't true. They saw someone who didn't belong. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The camera of the live stream was zoomed in on her, broadcasting her impromptu speech to the world. The comments section, which had been a celebration of Paul and Susan's firing, suddenly grew quiet, then shifted. She's right. This happens all the time. It's not just them, it's the whole culture. Zoe was reframing the entire event. She was taking her personal humiliation and turning it into a public lecture on systemic bias. Your supervisor didn't even look at my ticket, she said, her eyes locked on the CEO's. The evidence was in his hand, but it didn't matter, because the story he'd already decided on was more powerful than the truth. He called me a disturbance, because my presence here in this seat disturbed his idea of how the world is supposed to look. What does that say about the culture you built at this airline? The question was an arrow, and it hit its mark. The CEO had no answer. He had come put out a fire, and instead found himself in a masterclass about the very foundations of his company. He was silent, trapped on a video call in front of millions of people, being forced to confront a truth far more expensive and difficult to fix than two rogue employees. He came to solve a problem, but Zoe was explaining that he was a problem. He opened his mouth to offer a standard corporate platitude, but Zoe spoke first, her tone shifting from explanation to instruction. And that's why, she said, her voice now cool and sharp as steel, a simple apology isn't going to fix this. Here's what is. The CEO on the screen was trapped. He was in a boardroom miles away. But in that moment, he was a prisoner in seat 2A, held captive by the calm, steady gaze of a 17-year-old. He had expected to give orders, to clean up a mess. He never expected to be taking them. Here's what is going to happen, Zoe said, and the entire first-class cabin, along with millions of people watching online, fell completely silent. This was no longer a negotiation. It was a hostile takeover of his company's moral compass. First, Zoe began, her voice clear and strong, this incident will not be buried. Your company will issue a formal public apology, not just for the inconvenience, but for the systemic bias demonstrated by your staff. You will name the problem racial prejudice. The CEO's jaw tightened. This was already moving beyond a standard PR response. Second, she continued, firing 2 people is a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. You will fund an independent, external audit of your entire corporate training program for identifying and combating implicit bias. My cybersecurity firm will have full oversight to ensure its integrity. We're going to see your data. Now it was personal. She was bringing her company, her power, directly into his. Third, you're going to invest in the future you claim to want. You will establish a multi-million-dollar scholarship and mentorship program for Black and other minority students who want to become pilots, engineers, and executives. Because the reason I look out of place in this cabin is because for generations, you haven't made any room. This was the moment that transformed everything. A teenager was sitting on an airplane, using the leverage of a viral video to dictate corporate policy to a billion-dollar company. She wasn't just asking for justice for herself. She was demanding a better future for everyone who looked like her. She had turned her own humiliation into a weapon, and she was pointing at the heart of the system that had created it. Zoe finished speaking and then simply waited. She didn't fidget. She didn't look away. She held the CEO's gaze through the screen, an unbreakable line of connection between the problem and its solution. On the screen, the powerful man looked down for a long moment, the gears turning in his head. He was weighing the cost of capitulation against the cost of a global boycott. The entire plane and its massive, unseen digital audience held its breath. The future of his airline rested on his next word. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. On the laptop screen, the CEO of a global airline, a man used to giving orders that moved thousands of people and billions of dollars, looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. He was cornered, and he knew it. He had 2 options: refuse and become the face of a racism scandal that would cost his company hundreds of millions and destroy its reputation, or agree and swallow the most humiliating pill of his corporate life in front of a live, global audience. It wasn't really a choice at all. He took a deep breath, and the entire world seemed to lean in. "Ms. Washington," he said, his voice stripped of all its earlier bravado, now just tired and defeated. "You're right." He looked directly into the camera, not just speaking to Zoe, but to the millions of unseen viewers who held his company's fate in their hands. Consider it done. All of it. The public apology, the independent audit under your firm's oversight, and the scholarship program. My team will be in touch to work out the details, but you have my word. This will happen. It was an unconditional surrender. There was no negotiation, no pushback, no attempt to water down her demands. It was a swift, brutal calculus of a man who knew he was beaten. The authority of his position meant nothing against the power of a story whose time had come. In that moment, the entire corporate hierarchy of the airline became meaningless. The chain of command didn't just break. It evaporated. The highest authority in the company had just publicly ceded power to a 17-year-old passenger. The remaining flight attendants stood frozen in the galley, their faces a mixture of terror and disbelief. Their rule book was gone. Their managers had been publicly executed. They were now taking orders from a girl in a hoodie. On the live stream, the comment section exploded into a supernova of celebration. She did it. Queen. A teenager just took down a whole corporation. It was a cathartic payoff everyone had been waiting for. Justice wasn't just served. It was delivered in a spectacular, undeniable fashion. Zoe simply nodded once, accepting a surrender. "Thank you," she said, her voice even. "I'll be expecting your call." And with that, she reached forward and ended the video chat. The CEO's face vanished. The battle was won. But the plane was still flying, a metal tube suspended 30,000 feet in the air, hurtling toward a new reality. The digital war was over, but the real-world consequences, with corporate security, federal agents, and news crews, were waiting on the ground. The rest of the flight was silent, but it was a loud, heavy silence. The remaining flight crew moved like ghosts, avoiding eye contact with everyone, especially with Zoe. The other first-class passengers sat stiffly, occasionally stealing glances at the teenage girl in Seat 2A who had single-handedly dismantled their entire corporate structure mid-flight. When the wheels finally touched down in San Francisco, it wasn't the gentle bump of a normal landing. It felt like a gavel striking a podium, signaling the final judgment. As the plane taxied to the gate, the flashing blue and red lights on the tarmac told the story. This wasn't a normal arrival. The moment the seatbelt sign switched off, two grim-faced men in sharp suits stepped onto the plane before anyone could even stand up. They weren't smiling. "Paul? Susan?" one of them said, his voice quiet but firm. The two disgraced employees, who had been hiding in the galley, emerged looking pale and broken. There was no argument, no final plea. They were escorted down the jet bridge, their heads bowed in a final, public walk of shame, their careers ending not with a retirement party, but with silent escort from corporate security. A few moments later, federal agents came aboard for Mark Peterson, who was officially taken into custody. 3 antagonists, 3 consequences. The justice was swift, clean, and undeniable. Finally, the cabin was quiet, truly quiet. All the tension, all the aggression, all the prejudice had been unceremoniously removed. For the first time since she boarded, Zoe could just sit. She leaned her head back against the plush leather of seat 2A. This was the seat she had paid for, the seat she had been denied, the seat she had fought for. And now it was a throne. It was a symbol of a battle won not with shouting or anger, but with quiet intelligence and hidden power. She opened her laptop, the screen illuminating her calm, focused face. The immediate threat was gone. But as she glanced at her phone, the screen was a chaotic waterfall of notifications. Hundreds of texts, dozens of missed calls from major news networks, and a social media feed where her name was the #1 trending topic worldwide. The fight on the plane was over, but the story was now a global phenomenon. A story like this doesn't just end when the plane lands. In the days that followed, the video from that flight wasn't just a viral clip anymore. It was a cultural landmark. It played on a loop on every major news network. It was analyzed on talk shows, debated in articles, and shared millions of times over. The incident on that plane became a flashpoint, a single perfect example of the quiet, ugly prejudice that so many people face every single day. It was so blatant, so well documented, and the payoff so dramatic that it became impossible for anyone to ignore. It forced a conversation that corporations have been avoiding for decades. The airline, true to the CEO's word, began its public self-destruction and rebuilding. The apology was front-page news. The audit of their training programs, overseen by Zoe's firm, was announced in a press release. But the real change came from fear. Other airlines, watching their competitor get torn apart online, scrambled to get ahead of the story. Suddenly, every major carrier was issuing statements about their unwavering commitment to diversity and inclusion. They announced new mandatory bias training, new policy reviews, new task forces. It was a flurry of corporate panic, disguised as progress. And what about Zoe? She was no longer an anonymous teenager. She became one of the most famous CEOs in the world overnight. Her cybersecurity firm, once known only in niche tech circles, was now a household name, celebrated not just for its technical skill in catching a smuggler, but for the iron will of its young leader. Interview requests flooded in from every corner of the globe. Fortune 500 companies, desperate to be on the right side of history, started calling, wanted to hire her firm for security audits, and, more importantly, to be associated with her name. Isn't it ironic? For years, entire departments full of highly paid executives, diversity consultants, and PR experts had talked in circles about how to fix these problems. They held meetings, created PowerPoints, and issued empty statements. And in the end, it took a 17-year-old girl, armed with a valid ticket and a refusal to be erased, to force them all to actually do something. She didn't just get to her seat. She forced an entire industry to question who gets to sit in the front of the plane and why. The world saw a hero, a symbol of a new generation's power. But as the news cycle moved on and the corporate statements faded, the real question remained. The world had been changed by what happened in seat 2A. But what about the girl who had to fight for it? Weeks later, another plane, another first-class cabin. The chime for takeoff sounds the same. The plush leather of seat 2A feels the same. But the air is fundamentally different. It's no longer thick with casual entitlement, but with something else. Caution. Zoe sits by the window, her laptop open, fingers flying across lines of code. She's wearing a hoodie, this time a simple gray one, a quiet statement that she will not change who she is. The flight attendant approaches, his movements precise and careful. "Ms. Washington, can I get you anything before takeoff?" he asks, his voice laced with a nervous deference. The question is layered with an unspoken truth. "We know who you are. We have all seen the training video. Please don't let this be a repeat." This is her new normal. She is no longer invisible. She is hypervisible. The other passengers, men in tailored suits who might once have scoffed, now give her quick, nervous smiles before looking away. They don't see a girl who doesn't belong. They see a symbol, a giant slayer, a walking headline. But is she respected, or is she just feared? Is this progress, or is it simply brand management? This is the new currency of her freedom, not acceptance, but fear. She is no longer judged for her skin color, but for her power. Her presence now commands performative respect born from a corporation's terror of another PR disaster. She won. She exposed a criminal, humbled a corporation, and forced a global conversation. She sits in her seat, unbothered, a living monument to what happens when hidden power is finally revealed. But the victory tastes bittersweet. She shouldn't have had to fight. She shouldn't have needed the FBI on standby and a CEO on speed dial just to claim a space she paid for. Her victory is a testament to her strength, but it's also a permanent scar on a system that made the fight necessary in the first place. She has created a shield for herself, but it is a shield only she gets to carry. She is safe now, but what happens tomorrow on a different airline in a different city, to the next young black doctor, the next brilliant artist, the next student who steps into a space where they are deemed out of place? What happens when they don't have a multi-million-dollar company at their back? Who fights for them when the cameras are off and the world isn't watching? This story had millions of witnesses. But how many similar stories happen every day with no camera, no live stream, and no justice? If you believe these stories matter, share your voice. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Was this justice or was it overdue correction? And if you know silence is no longer an option, subscribe. Every subscription helps keep these stories alive. Every subscription makes sure the next Zoe doesn't have to fight alone in seat 2A.